People love to hate on JavaScript because it seems there's a new framework every single day. But why are people creating these? Well, what they're trying to do is to solve real life problems. For instance, you might have a page on your site that's static and you don't need it to change. So wouldn't it be great if you could just globally cache that on a CDN so that it's really fast for your end user? However, you might also have another page that needs to be dynamic. The entire page has a bunch of dynamic content. So when somebody comes, you don't want to send them a static page. You want to generate that live on the server and send that back to them. Or maybe you have some kind of hybrid approach where you want most of the content to be static and little sections that are more dynamic. Those dynamic needs are usually one of two things. Either you want it to be really customizable, but it does not need to be interactive, or you don't care how customizable it is, it needs to be interactive, like a cart in a shopping site, for instance. So how do we handle all of these? Well, that's what these JavaScript frameworks are trying to do. Now, Astro has just thrown its little hat to the ring with a new idea, and that is called Astro Islands. Now, it's had islands in the past, but they've always been client-side rendered. The idea in the past was you might have some section on your page that needs React after the fact, so you can ship a static or SSR page, and then afterwards, that component will be hydrated by JavaScript that needs to make it interactive. Now, a lot of people also use these little islands because they want something to be customized. So you can ship a static page and then some client-side JavaScript customizes a little section. Wouldn't it be great though if you could do that customization on the server? That's the idea of Astro's Server Islands. Now, this is just a first look. They just released this as an experimental feature, and I just want to walk through kind of the strategy that Astro is approaching, why you might want to use it, the benefits of it. But essentially, that's the question that Astro is trying to solve. How can you take a component on your page that doesn't need to be dynamic, it doesn't need to be hydrated by JavaScript, it just needs to be customizable? Wouldn't it be great if the server could do that? And that's what Server Islands are all about. Let's check it out. Hey, what's up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. Okay, so let's look at this really cool new feature in a few different ways. First of all, I've got the blog post open here, and I'll leave this so you can peruse it, but let's just look at it first graphically. You can see here that what you can have is a static rendered page, where you then have individual components that are not rendered on the client, but rather on the server and streamed in a little bit later. So this is Astro's response to things like streaming and server components and all that kind of stuff. So let's now actually look at it in practice, and then I want to show you my own little graph and talk through the different varying rendering options you now have in Astro. So to start with, here's a simple example. You can see that this entire page is just a blog post, so it can be static. In fact, it should be static, right? So that it can be indexed by Google and all that kind of stuff. But I might be logged in over here, and I want a personalized response. Up until now, the only way to handle this would be have some client-side JavaScript that then fetches this and puts in this on the client. But then the client is having to run JavaScript. Now, for something small like this, it's not a big deal. But what Astro Islands gives us the opportunity to do is to have something streamed in later from the server so that the client is still not running any JavaScript, but we have dynamic content on a page, like in this case, if you're logged in. So let me show you what this looks like. If I open up the dev console and we jump over here to network, and then let's look at JavaScript. If I refresh this, you'll notice I don't get any JavaScript on this page, but I have some customization. How is that happening? Well, there's actually a fetch request going on here. And if I inspect this here, you'll notice that if it'll let me, here we go. All right. When I went ahead and requested it, it's just a post request to a specific endpoint. We're using the Server Islands infrastructure to do this. The post response is just HTML. So it's actually giving me back markup, but it's server run, it's server side rendered. And I've got this spot on my site blocked out for it. Therefore, the client is running zero JavaScript, but I'm still getting dynamic content that's all done server side. So let's look at a more complicated example, because in this case, we're saving literal bytes. Here, we've got this entire page for this getaway. Now, all this is not going to change, so I want this to be statically rendered. However, I may have some customization right here. I may have reviews. I may have a special offer, an avatar, all this kind of stuff that I want to be rendered on the server so that it can be dynamic and customized to the user, but I don't want to ship a bunch of JavaScript. So if I refresh the page, you'll notice that's exactly what we've got here. I've got all this right here statically rendered. Whenever I build my site, that's just static HTML, which on top of just being faster also means it can be cached in CDNs all over the globe, so it's way faster for the user for that first content load. But notice all this extra stuff down here is all server-side rendered and streamed in once it's ready. So once again, let's open up the JavaScript console, look at network tab here, and right here under this fetch, you'll notice I've got several things that are all pending and then they eventually come in. Once again, what am I getting back? Well, just straight up markup, right? All this is just coming in from the server. Now, what this means is you kind of get the best of both worlds. you don't have to server-side render an entire page. You can statically render the page so it can be distributed across to CDN and really lightning fast. And then you can individually get this customization without having to run a bunch of client-side JavaScript. So that's kind of a look at how it works in practice. A few simple examples here. Let's now talk about rendering strategies and how this fits into their overall rendering strategies. So up until now, what you've had is a couple of different options. You have static site generation. This is Astro's default mode. Very simply put, whenever somebody requests a page, your server has already pre-built these as static HTML files. This means that this can be cached globally. So this might be like a CDN here, and you can just go request that from whatever's closest to you. It returns it back, and because it's cached and globally distributed, it can be super fast. It just ships back static HTML. The other option you had was one of the two options for server-side rendering. Here you've got a server option. In this case, you don't pre-build HTML files, you pre-build the functions needed with an SSR adapter to then create those files. So when the client requests a certain page, the server goes and it actually has to go back to the server itself, not to some cached CDN, because again, these are functions. It then generates that page, and let me just steal this right here. Then it will send the HTML, and the HTML eventually gets back to the client. So you get the customization of a server, and you get all that, but it's a little bit slower because it has to actually do all this live when the page is requested. All right. So you have to do that kind of whole page entire, right? Either the whole page is SSG or the whole page is SSR. Now, there is another option here for server-side rendering called hybrid, which is kind of the opposite of the standard server-side rendering, which means that they're all generated as functions. Now, what you can do instead is come over here and you can have all pages statically rendered by default, unless you happen to mark a particular page as being server-side rendered. You can actually do the opposite here as well. You can say, hey, I want this page to be HTML on the server output, and that will work as well. I don't want to get too much into this, but these are essentially the options we've had. In this case, what we've got is a bunch of HTML files, and if you happen to hit a route that you say, hey, I want this to be server-side rendered, the entire page, importantly, once again, is rendered and then sent back to you as HTML. Same thing we saw up top here. Now, what happens if you want some customization? Well, I've got this little chart over here. Let's say you've got this client site right here, and you've got all these things that can be static, like we just saw right over here, right? So all this can be static, but you've got little individual sections that you want to be more customizable or perhaps interactive. Now, if you want them to be interactive, you might ship something like React, but if you just want it to be customizable, it's kind of a shame to ship a bunch of client-side JavaScript just to make it customizable. Couldn't the server do that for you? And that's kind of the idea here. So right here up until now, we've had this thing called Astro Islands, which means all of this is statically rendered, even this right here, and all you're doing is shipping along some React or something like that to hydrate this post-page load, right? Or you can write client-side JavaScript, the same kind of idea here. But again, you've now kind of shifted the onus of responsibility to the client to have to do all this using JavaScript client-side. So what if, instead of doing that, we had all this static content, and then this right here could be customizable, and it doesn't need to be interactive. In other words, these right here, I don't need them to be especially interactive. They're just links, right? So all I would need is them to be customizable per the user. And then once they're on there, they can just be static HTML. So I may not want to ship a bunch of client-side JavaScript to essentially give me static HTML. So what I can do now with these server islands is, instead of shipping JavaScript or React or whatever it happens to be, I can simply mark this thing as server deferred. So if I come over here, server defer, I think that's how you do it. That's just way too big. Let's make this smaller. Smaller still, whatever. Anyhow, it says server defer like that. Now what I can do is ship the entire page right here as static HTML. And what it will do is, instead of shipping JavaScript, it will actually allow the server, using one of those server-side rendering strategies, to send HTML just for this individual component that then is streamed in and placed here after the fact. So again, this is really, really powerful and kind of a new idea, a new way of thinking about this. Now, next is shipped something that's similar to this, but it requires a lot more setup on the server, and it's also a little bit different conceptually. So I'm going to stick to what Astro's done here just to kind of keep it as simple as I possibly can. Now, again, the real power here is not just that we have these customizable sections. The real power is that the entire page can be cached by a CDN and is extra fast to start with. And then these little customizable sections can be sent along after the fact, similar to what like HTMX does. In fact, these are treated as partials in Astro. Now, I'll just make note of a couple of other things here. If you want to check out the actual example they have, so like this one right here, let's go ahead and do that just to kind of see how this looks in code, and then we'll do it ourselves. But I'll just also mention that if you want to look at the RFC and kind of where it currently stands. I'll let you read through all this. It's really helpful to understand the thinking behind it as well. So if I come over here to my index route, you'll see that I've got all these sections here. So let's jump inside here. You'll notice here that I've just got static HTML, but I have some of these sections down below that are going to be server render, right? Using the server islands architecture. And it's the server defer attribute that does this. Now notice here, I've got this customer reviews with all this markup inside in the middle, right? What is this right here? Well, all of this is the fallback, and you just provide this with a slot fallback. And that means this is what's shown before we get a response from the server. So let's actually look at this right here. So under components, we're going to look at customer reviews. Now notice I'm doing all this stuff server side, and it's going to fetch. And again, because this is all server code, this is all protected, right? So this isn't run client side ever. This is only ever run server side. And then it outputs this bit of HTML essentially, right? It does this using the Astro syntax. This is what's streamed back to the client. Where is it dropped? Well, if I jump back over here, it's dropped right in this bottom spot, right? Right inside here, it replaces everything inside of this fallback slot. I'll leave links for all this in the description, but hopefully that helps you understand how it actually works. So lastly, let's play with that ourselves. So I'm going to jump over this way. I'm using one of their templates, and I don't even remember which one it was. I think it's like the minimal or something like that. It doesn't really matter. What we're going to do is add some components. Now, because we're doing some server-side rendering, I do need to add an adapter. And if I jump over here, you'll notice that I do not yet have one. So let me come to my server. We'll just do npx astro add. And in this case, let's do something like, I guess we'll do for sell. All right, and just like that, we are up and running. I'll get this back up. Now, if I jump over here to this instruction to kind of show you how it all works, what we have to do is just add this little experimental config option. So let's do that right here. And I can leave this as server, or I can make it hybrid. Either way, it doesn't super matter. What matters is how I mark individual sections with this server defer. So let's actually create a little avatar component while we're at it. And maybe I'll just run over here to like my youtube.com like this. And let me grab this. Actually, I could just grab it right there, right? So we'll grab that right there. And then let's jump over here to the components, and let's create a new one called avatar.astro. All right, so up top here, let's say that our image, we're going to run this all server side supposedly. So I'm going to grab it right there. Obviously, you usually be doing some kind of fetch or something like that. But what we're going to do is have this little section here that's just going to be an image tag that gets generated and spit back this way. So here for this image, I'm just going to have the image piped in here. We'll just say like coding in public avatar. So obviously not super customizable, but this will be run server side, right? So let's go ahead and use this, and we're going to do it right on the index page, right over here. And actually, let's just get rid of a bunch of this stuff. All this, all this. All right, we're going to have an avatar right here. And inside here, I want to have a fallback. So let's have a div here with a slot of fallback. So here I could just have like a paragraph or something that says like image or whatever, just to show you where that fallback will be replaced with. And then I need to add server defer. Now, again, because this is experimental, in order for this to work, I have to make sure I set this experimental server islands flag to true. So with all that said, now this will load and after the fact replace my text that says image, right? Oops. So if I refresh, you'll see that it's so fast that it doesn't really help me too much. Okay, so that's obviously way too fast. So why don't we switch this up? And let's see, let's get rid of this. And we're going to invoke a function here. And to speed this up, let me write it and just show it to you. So we're just going to await a promise for 200 seconds or 200 milliseconds. Let's change that to 1.5 seconds. Then we will return this string right here. And this is what we want to await. So await fetch avatar. And this will just slow it down slightly like that. And now what we can do is we're getting this here. And after 2 seconds, then it populates. You'll notice though that I actually get this fallback starting right here because that's what I've set as my slot right here. So obviously I could have another image in here instead, and I'll just drop in a placeholder image 90 by 90. We'll say like avatar or whatever skeleton like that. And now it'll load that in to start with. And then after 2 seconds, it will actually load in my avatar. Now, obviously I might want this to be rounded or all that kind of stuff, but you can figure that out on your own. But the important part here is that no client-side JavaScript is being used to personalize, to customize the page here. And I don't need this to be interactive, so there's no reason to ship, for instance, like all of React or to write some client-side JavaScript to go ahead and fetch this after page load to speed up my page and allow it to be statically rendered. Now, in this case, I actually have the entire page server-side rendered as well, but all this is static itself, so I could obviously switch this over if I wanted to hybrid right here, which means the entire page will be statically built, and just this little section here will be streamed in after the fact. I hope that was a big help walking through the features of server islands as kind of our first look. Now, the benefits here is that you have a lot faster first content paint. You also can use this with any kind of deployment platform, any CDN, and they've built this on existing technology. That means you get all the benefits of server islands and you don't have to really think about anything else besides adding that defer::server attribute. Well, I'll be exploring this more as they flesh this out, but I wanted to at least give my first thoughts on this here a couple of weeks late now that I've played with it a little bit. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Happy coding.